When the justice system fails, sometimes the last hope for fairness comes from unexpected places. Will this woman's silent defiance against systemic racism change the course of her trial, or will the courtroom continue to be a battleground for injustice? The air in the Montgomery courtroom was thick with tension. The wood-paneled walls, aged and imposing, seemed to swallow the whispers of those present. At the center of the room sat Margaret Lewis, a 72-year-old black woman, her small frame dwarfed by the towering desk before her. Though her hands trembled slightly against the fabric of her worn purse, her eyes held a steady resolve. This was not fear. This was the weight of decades of struggle, of knowing what it meant to be unheard. Across the bench, Judge William Thornton barely lifted his gaze. His reputation for dismissing cases involving minorities was well known, whispered in hushed conversations outside the courthouse doors. Today was no different. His fingers scrolled lazily across his phone, his expression vacant as Margaret's attorney, James Carter, stood to speak. "Your Honor, my client has been accused of a crime she did not commit." "The evidence, Mr. Carter," the judge interrupted, finally looking up, his voice dripping with impatience. "Let's not waste the court's time. We have real criminals to deal with." James exhaled sharply, steadying himself. He had been here before. He knew this battle well. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the only thing wasting this court's time is an injustice that should never have reached trial. My client was arrested over an alleged theft of a loaf of bread, an accusation that has no evidence, no witnesses, and no basis in fact. The store's security footage shows no wrongdoing on her part." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple, as if the very act of listening was an unbearable burden. "Do you have this so-called footage?" James nodded and gestured toward the bailiff, who moved to set up the video. The grainy footage flickered onto the screen. It showed Margaret entering the store, moving slowly through the aisles. She picked up a loaf of bread, examined it, and placed it back on the shelf before heading to the counter to purchase a carton of milk. No theft, no crime. Silence hung in the room. The evidence was irrefutable. Margaret sat motionless, her fingers gripping the purse tighter, waiting. This should be the moment where justice prevailed. But they all knew better. Judge Thornton cleared his throat. "This proves nothing. Perhaps she returned the stolen item later. Or maybe the footage does not cover every angle of the store. Regardless, the officer on duty had probable cause to make the arrest, and that is enough." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the small audience. James's jaw clenched. "Your Honor, are we seriously going to convict a woman with no criminal record, no evidence against her, and a clear video proving her innocence?" The judge leaned back, his gaze settling on Margaret for the first time. "The law is the law, Mr. Carter." Margaret, silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice, though soft, carried through the room. "And whose law is that, sir? Because it surely does not serve people like me." A heavy pause followed her words. Judge Thornton's expression darkened, his discomfort evident, but he quickly masked it with indifference. "The verdict stands. The court finds the defendant guilty." The gavel struck, final and absolute. A stunned silence followed, then outrage. James slammed his hands on the table. "This is a disgrace." Margaret remained still. A quiet dignity surrounded her, even in the face of injustice. As officers approached to escort her out, she stood on her own, lifting her chin slightly. She had faced worse, but that did not make it right. As she was led away, a single voice from the back of the courtroom rose above the chaos. "This is not justice!" Others followed. The murmurs grew into shouts. People stood. A spark ignited, a moment that might become something more. Margaret had lost the case, but something else had begun. A fight that would not be ignored. A reckoning that was long overdue. James Carter stood before the bench, his stance firm, his voice even. "Your Honor, if I may present the evidence—" Judge William Thornton let out an exaggerated sigh, his disinterest unmistakable. He barely lifted his eyes from the glowing screen of his phone. The courtroom, already steeped in quiet tension, felt even heavier as the weight of dismissal settled over everyone present. Margaret Lewis sat in her chair, watching the judge's detached expression. A lifetime of experiences told her exactly what was happening. She turned her gaze to the jury, searching for any signs of concern. The faces staring back at her were indifferent, detached, some even bored. A pit formed in her stomach. These people had already made up their minds. James cleared his throat, attempting again. "Your Honor, if I could direct the court's attention to—" The judge raised a hand, his eyes still locked on his phone. "Mr. Carter, let's not drag this out. This is a waste of time. Let's move to sentencing." A stunned silence rippled through the room. Gasps echoed from the sparse audience. Even James, experienced in fighting against systemic injustice, found himself momentarily frozen. His mind raced, grasping for the right words to counter this blatant disregard for due process. Margaret's breath quickened. She knew this moment, this feeling of helplessness in the face of power. But there was something else, too, an anger that had simmered for years, now rising to the surface. James took a step forward. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we have not even reviewed the evidence. There is clear video footage." "I have heard enough," the judge cut in. "This court has real criminals to deal with. Let's not waste any more time." Margaret's hands clenched around her purse. She sat up straighter. Her voice, though calm, carried across the room. "So, that is it. You have already decided?" Judge Thornton finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Lewis, the law is clear." Margaret held his gaze. "It may be clear to you, but it is not just." The murmurs in the room grew louder. James turned, meeting Margaret's eyes. He could see the fire there, the unshakable resolve. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, if you refuse to hear the evidence, you are violating this woman's rights. This court is meant to uphold justice, not dismiss it at convenience." The judge's lip curled in irritation. "Mr. Carter, I will not tolerate disruptions in my courtroom. The verdict stands." James slammed his hands on the table. "This is a mockery of justice." The judge ignored him, motioning for the bailiff. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering herself. She had seen this play out before. Different times, different faces, but always the same outcome. As the bailiff moved toward her, the tension in the room thickened. Then a voice rang out from the back. "This is not justice." Another followed. "You cannot silence us." The energy in the room shifted. More voices joined in. A movement stirred in the air, something larger than this single moment. Margaret may have lost her trial, but she had not lost the fight. As she was led away, she lifted her chin. This was far from over. Margaret Lewis sat still, her mind racing as the judge dismissed her case without so much as a glance in her direction. The gavel had not yet struck, but she knew where this was headed. The weight of injustice pressed down on her, familiar yet no less suffocating. Then, without hesitation, she reached into her small purse. The subtle movement caught the attention of a few in the courtroom, but the judge remained glued to his phone. Margaret's fingers found her own device, and with a steady hand she dialed a number. The ringing echoed in the quiet room. Heads turned. James Carter, standing beside her, tensed. The prosecutor furrowed his brow. But the judge? He barely looked up, still scrolling. Then a voice burst through the speaker. "This is Attorney General Daniel Whitmore. Who am I speaking to?" A beat of silence stretched through the room. The judge's fingers froze over his screen. The prosecutor shifted in his seat. A few jurors leaned forward. Margaret exhaled calmly, bringing the phone closer. "Sir, my name is Margaret Lewis. I am in Judge Reynolds' courtroom, where I am being denied my right to a fair trial." The judge's face drained of color. The entire courtroom hung on her words. Even James seemed momentarily stunned, his eyes flickering from Margaret to the now rigid judge. Attorney General Whitmore's voice came sharp and unwavering. "Explain." Margaret sat up straighter. "I have been accused of a crime I did not commit. There is evidence proving my innocence, but Judge Reynolds refuses to review it. Instead, he has dismissed my attorney, refused to hear my case, and is moving straight to sentencing. I do not believe this is justice, sir." A murmur spread through the room like wildfire. The judge, now visibly rattled, attempted to regain control. "Ms. Lewis, this is highly inappropriate." "Judge Reynolds," the Attorney General's voice cut through the air. "Are you presiding over this case?" The judge cleared his throat. "Well, yes, but this is a simple matter. The defendant, a simple matter." Whitmore's voice carried authority, demanding attention. "Denying a defendant the right to a fair trial is a serious violation of judicial ethics. I assume court transcripts and case records will reflect this conversation." Margaret kept her expression steady, but inside her heart pounded. She watched as Judge Reynolds swallowed hard. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a way out. But there was none. The eyes of the courtroom were locked onto him. The prosecutor looked away, as if distancing himself from the mess unfolding. James stood straighter, his confidence returning. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "perhaps we should take a moment to properly review the evidence before making any decisions." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. He was cornered, and he knew it. Slowly, he set down his phone and folded his hands on the bench. "We will take a brief recess." The tension in the room eased just slightly, but Margaret knew this was only the beginning. She had forced a shift in power, but justice was still hanging in the balance. As she lowered the phone from her ear, James leaned toward her, his voice low but filled with admiration. "That," he murmured, "was one hell of a move." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. It was not over, not yet, but for the first time in a long while, the fight did not feel so one-sided. Judge Reynolds slammed his gavel against the bench, the sharp crack echoing through the courtroom. His voice, usually so commanding, wavered as he barked, "You cannot make calls in my courtroom. Hang up immediately." Margaret Lewis did not move. Her phone remained pressed to her ear, her posture unwavering. Every eye in the courtroom was on her now. The weight of power had shifted, and for the first time, it was not in the judge's hands. James Carter, emboldened by the moment, crossed his arms and met the judge's furious gaze. "Your Honor, are you denying her legal rights on record?" A hush fell over the room. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The judge, who had controlled every aspect of this trial with indifference and arrogance, suddenly found himself on the defensive. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his gavel. Margaret did not flinch. Her voice was steady as she spoke into the phone. "Attorney General Whitmore, I have witnesses here who can testify to judicial misconduct. I suggest you send someone down." The judge stiffened. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the jury, who were now fully engaged. Some jurors exchanged glances, their prior detachment replaced by curiosity and concern. The Attorney General's voice, crisp and unwavering, came through the speaker. "Witnesses, you say?" Margaret scanned the room, then nodded as if Whitmore could see her. "Yes, sir. The entire courtroom has witnessed Judge Reynolds dismiss evidence, ignore testimony, and attempt to rush a verdict without due process. This is not a fair trial." The judge's composure cracked. "Enough!" His voice cracked slightly as he banged the gavel once more. "This is outrageous. You have no right—" "She has every right, Your Honor," James interrupted, his voice cutting through the judge's rage. "And unless you want federal investigators sitting in that chair, I suggest you start following the law." Gasps spread through the courtroom. The judge's face burned red, his jaw tightening as he searched for an escape. But there was none. He had backed himself into a corner, and Margaret had forced his hand. "Your Honor," the prosecutor finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Perhaps we should take a moment to consider the gravity of this situation." Reynolds shot him a withering glare, but the damage was done. The courtroom was no longer his to command. His reputation, his authority, everything hung in the balance, exposed for all to see. The judge's voice faltered. He swallowed hard, looking at Margaret, then James, then back at the jury whose eyes bored into him like silent judges of their own. Finally, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. His hand, still gripping the gavel, trembled as he slowly set it down. "We will take a recess." Margaret exhaled slowly, victory humming beneath her skin. She had not won the war, but she had struck a decisive blow. James leaned toward her, lowering his voice. "This fight isn't over." Margaret nodded, her grip tightening around the phone. "No, it is not." And for the first time in that courtroom, the judge was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Within minutes, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 federal officers stepped inside, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere. All eyes turned to them, and a hush fell over the room. Judge Reynolds, seated behind the bench, visibly stiffened. His fingers twitched over his gavel as his eyes darted around, searching for an escape that did not exist. One of the officers, a tall man with a firm voice, stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have been instructed to review this case for potential judicial misconduct." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Some jurors sat up straighter. Margaret Lewis, still calm, finally lowered her phone and placed it back into her purse. Her work, for now, was done. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure. "This is highly irregular. I demand to know on what grounds." "The Attorney General's orders," the officer interrupted. "And, considering the testimony we just overheard, there is plenty of reason for concern." Reynolds opened his mouth, then shut it again. Beads of sweat formed at his temple. For the first time in his courtroom, he was not in control. The second officer approached the bench. "Your Honor, please hand over your phone. It is now considered evidence." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge hesitated, his grip tightening around the device. His once unwavering authority crumbled in real time before everyone's eyes. He swallowed hard before finally, begrudgingly, setting the phone down on the desk. The officer picked it up, slipping it into an evidence bag. "This trial is now under federal review," he announced. "Until further notice, Judge Reynolds, you are relieved of your duties." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the prosecutor seemed taken aback. Margaret closed her eyes and let out a slow, steady breath. It was not the end, but it was a step toward justice. James Carter turned to her, his voice low. "Margaret, you just did something incredible." She opened her eyes and met his gaze. "I just did what needed to be done." As the judge was escorted out, the power in the room shifted once more. This time, it belonged to the people who had been silenced for too long. Days after the dramatic events in the Montgomery courtroom, the consequences of Judge Reynolds' actions began to unfold. Federal investigators launched an inquiry into his judicial record, uncovering a disturbing pattern of misconduct. Cases he had presided over were re-examined, and multiple complaints from past defendants and attorneys surfaced. The evidence was damning. By the end of the week, Judge Reynolds had been officially placed under investigation for repeated judicial misconduct. His once powerful presence in the courtroom had diminished, replaced by an image of disgrace and accountability. Margaret Lewis's case was swiftly dismissed. The charges against her, baseless from the start, were erased from the system. She walked out of the courthouse, a free woman, but she knew that true justice was not just about her own freedom. It was about making sure this never happened to anyone else. Though her personal battle had been won, the larger war against systemic injustice had only begun. Her name had become a rallying cry, her fight an example of what resilience could accomplish. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, supporters, activists, reporters. News of her defiance had spread rapidly, capturing the attention of national media. Cameras flashed as she stepped forward, facing the swarm of journalists. The people who had once ignored her now hung on to her every word. Her story had become more than just one woman's fight. It was now a symbol of a much larger issue. What had begun as a simple courtroom battle had sparked something far greater, a national conversation on justice and fairness. Attorney General Daniel Whitmore addressed the nation in a press conference. "The events that transpired in Judge Reynolds' courtroom are unacceptable. The integrity of our justice system must be upheld, and that starts with accountability. Effective immediately, my office is launching a full-scale probe into biased rulings across the state. No judge is above the law. This is a time for change, and we will not allow these injustices to continue unchecked." The impact was immediate. Courtrooms across the country came under scrutiny. Civil rights groups called for reforms. The conversation about racial bias in the judicial system gained new momentum, fueled by Margaret's courage to stand her ground when no one else would. Lawmakers debated policies to ensure fair trials for all citizens, regardless of race or social status. The ripple effect of her case had reached far beyond what anyone had imagined. A reporter stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Mrs. Lewis, did you ever imagine your case would spark such a movement?" Margaret, standing tall despite her age, gave a small smile. "I may be old, but I am not invisible. No one should be. This fight is bigger than me. It always has been. And it is far from over. If my experience can prevent even one more person from being unfairly treated, then it has all been worth it. We must continue to hold those in power accountable. We must continue to demand fairness. We must never stop fighting for justice." Her words resonated. The world had watched as she refused to be silenced. And now, change felt possible. The voices of those who had suffered in silence for too long were now being heard. Her bravery had inspired a movement that would not fade into the background. As she walked away from the courthouse steps, she knew her battle was far from over. But this time, she would not be fighting alone. Others would take up the fight alongside her. And this time, the system would have no choice but to listen.